The morning sun blazed over Dry Creek Air Base, but inside Hangar 4, the F-15 Strike Eagle lay dead. Silent, cold, and defeated. For 3 days, the best young engineers couldn't make it breathe again. Then, a slow, uneven rhythm echoed through the hangar. The sound of a man walking on metal. He was old, a veteran with a steel leg, a weathered face, and a canvas tool bag older than most of the crew. "Who called this relic in?" someone laughed. But minutes later, when his scarred hand tapped the jet's skin with an old screwdriver, the hangar shook with thunder. The engines roared to life, the floor trembled, and every smirk vanished. That day, they didn't just witness a repair. They witnessed a legend with an iron leg bring steel back to life. The morning sun over Dry Creek Air Base burned through the thin desert haze, glinting off the metal roofs and the long line of aircraft waiting in silence. Frank Mallory walked slowly across the tarmac, his right leg, a prosthetic of brushed steel, striking the concrete with a steady, rhythmic tap. At 79, he moved with the patience of a man who had learned to measure time in survival, not seconds. His weathered face, carved with deep lines and sunspots, held the calm of someone who had already faced the worst the world could offer. His gray hair was cropped short, and his faded blue eyes carried both sharpness and sorrow. The scars along his jaw disappeared beneath a trimmed white beard, and each step he took seemed to echo a history no one there understood. At the hangar's entrance stood Staff Sergeant Blake Carter, a man in his late 20s with the posture of someone who'd never been told no. Blake had a square, handsome face, but eyes that betrayed arrogance rather than confidence. He had joined the Air Force straight from college, his reputation built on digital precision and efficiency. To him, people like Frank represented a past better left behind. Behind Blake was Airman Julia Ross, 24, slender, with auburn hair tucked neatly under her cap. Her face was open and alert, and though she said little, she watched everything. She had joined the service after her father, a mechanic, died in a factory accident, a wound that left her both driven and quietly protective toward those she sensed were being mistreated. As Frank approached, Blake folded his arms. "They really sent you," he said with a smirk. "Sir, we needed a specialist, not a story from a museum." Frank stopped, his cane resting lightly in one hand, and for a moment the sunlight caught the steel of his leg, a glimmer like defiance. He looked past Blake, toward the silent F-15, waiting in the hangar's shadow. His voice was low, but steady. "Then maybe it's time someone listened to what the old stories still know." Blake Carter crossed his arms tighter as Frank's calm voice faded into the heavy air of the hangar. The old man's words carried a quiet authority that irritated him more than any argument could. Around them, the whir of cooling fans and the faint hum of power units filled the silence. Blake motioned to his crew to continue diagnostics, pretending not to care. "We're fine, sir," he said, his tone clipped. "Our system scan is 99% complete. There's nothing wrong that can't be fixed through the console." Frank tilted his head, studying the massive F-15 like one might study an injured animal. His gaze lingered on a small vibration near the landing gear that no one else seemed to notice. Behind him, Julia Ross hesitated, her fingers hovering above her tablet screen. She wanted to speak up, to ask what the old man saw. But the tension between the two men froze her in place. From the far side of the hangar, Master Sergeant Cole Henderson entered, his presence commanding instant attention. Henderson was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with dark skin and eyes that missed nothing. Known for his fairness but strictness, he had risen through the ranks from humble beginnings, often reminding his men that respect had to be earned, not demanded. He paused when he saw Frank and frowned slightly, recognizing him from old photos in the base archive. "That man built half the birds we fly," he muttered under his breath. Blake didn't hear it. He was too busy proving himself. "With all due respect," Blake said louder now, "this jet doesn't need nostalgia, it needs software." Frank smiled faintly, tapping his metal leg on the floor. "Then let's see which runs smoother, son. Your code or a heartbeat?" The challenge hung between them as the engines of another jet roared outside, shaking the hangar walls. And for the first time, even Julia couldn't tell who was about to be proven wrong. The faint metallic ring from Frank's tap lingered in the air, and for a fleeting second, even the hum of machines seemed to fade. His hand rested on the cool fuselage of the F-15, and his eyes, once sharp with irritation, grew distant. The hangar disappeared in his mind, replaced by the blistering heat of Da Nang in 1972. He was 30 then, lean and sunburned, with a full head of dark hair and the reckless confidence of a man who thought courage could outlast war. The sky had been thick with smoke, the air filled with the metallic taste of fear. Mortar fire rained down near the runway as he crawled beneath a wounded F-4 Phantom, clutching the same wrench that now trembled in his old hand. A young pilot named Henry Cole had been shouting above the roar, his voice cracking with desperation. Henry, barely 20, with freckles scattered across his nose and a grin too young for the battlefield, had been like a younger brother to him. The sound of the last explosion still echoed in Frank's memory, the one that took his leg but saved Henry's life. Back in the present, Julia noticed Frank's breathing change, shallow but steady, like someone surfacing from deep water. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked softly. Frank blinked, returning to the moment, and looked at her with a faint smile. "I'm fine. Just listening to an old friend." Blake scoffed from across the hangar, shaking his head. "The plane doesn't talk, old man." But Julia took a hesitant step closer, drawn by the weight in Frank's voice. "Maybe not to you," Frank murmured, pressing his palm against the aircraft's scarred panel. "But it's trying to tell me what's hurting." He leaned closer, his face inches from the metal, when suddenly a thin hiss escaped from deep within the jet, like a breath from something alive. The hiss that had escaped from the jet still hung in the air when Blake's patience snapped. He stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles along his neck stood out. "Touch that plane again, old man, and I'll have security drag you out of here." His voice echoed sharply across the hangar, cutting through the quiet like a whip. Frank slowly turned his head, the fluorescent light glinting off his steel leg as he studied the younger man. There was no anger in his expression, only something colder. Disappointment. "Tell me, Sergeant," he said evenly, "have you ever asked why it won't start?" Blake let out a short laugh that didn't sound real. "Because it's software, not some ghost whispering to you through the metal." His arrogance drew a few nervous smirks from the team, but Julia Ross shifted uncomfortably, her brown eyes darting between them. She could feel something heavy in Frank's tone, like he was hearing things the rest of them couldn't. "No," Frank said quietly. "It's not starting because no one's listening." He took one step closer, the soft thud of his cane and the hollow clang of his leg landing together. "Machines talk," he continued. "You just forgot their language." The hangar fell silent. Even the hum of the overhead fans seemed to fade. Then, breaking the tension, a tall woman in a dark blue security uniform entered. Lieutenant Naomi Price, 32, sharp-eyed and composed. Her dark hair was pulled tight in a bun, her skin tanned from years on the flight line. Known for her calm authority, Naomi rarely raised her voice, but when she did, everyone listened. She paused at the doorway, sensing the heat of conflict. "Is there a problem here, Sergeant Carter?" she asked, her tone firm but even. Blake opened his mouth to answer, but Frank spoke first. "Only pride, Lieutenant," he said, his gaze still locked on Blake. "And that's the hardest thing to repair." 2 buildings away, in the command office overlooking the flight line, General Nathan Monroe was reviewing deployment schedules when the red phone on his desk rang, a line reserved for emergencies only. The gruff, battle-worn voice on the other end said, "Sir, they're throwing Frank Mallory out of Hangar 4. For a heartbeat, Monroe didn't speak. The lines on his weathered face deepened as his jaw tightened. At 68, Monroe was still built like a tank. Broad shoulders filling his crisp uniform, the silver in his close-cropped hair glinting under the fluorescent light. He had served in 3 wars and buried too many good men. One of them had nearly been Frank, 50 years ago in Da Nang. Slamming his pen onto the desk, Monroe stood, eyes blazing. "Throwing out my hero?" he growled. Without waiting for a response, he barked into his radio for his driver. Minutes later, a convoy of military vehicles screeched to a stop outside the hangar. Inside, Blake was still standing defiantly, Naomi watching him with barely concealed disapproval. When the massive hangar doors rolled open with a deafening groan, the sunlight poured in like judgment itself. General Monroe strode through it, tall, commanding, medals glinting against his chest. His voice carried the authority of decades. "Sergeant Carter!" he thundered, every syllable sharp as a blade. Blake's spine locked upright. Julia froze beside the F-15, her heart hammering. Even Naomi instinctively saluted. Monroe's cold eyes swept the room and found Frank. The transformation was immediate. His anger melted into something reverent. He walked up to the old man with slow, deliberate steps, then raised his hand in the crispest salute anyone there had ever seen. "Chief Mallory," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion, "on behalf of the United States Air Force, I apologize for the ignorance you've endured today." The hangar fell utterly silent, and Blake's world began to collapse. The echo of General Monroe's words still hung in the air as Frank lowered himself to one knee beside the F-15. His steel leg creaked faintly under the weight, a reminder of how much the years had taken and yet how much they had left behind. He ran his calloused fingers along the landing gear housing, his movements unhurried but precise, like a craftsman reacquainting himself with a long-lost creation. The younger airmen watched in silence now. Even Blake, his arrogance shattered, stood frozen a few steps away. Frank reached into his worn canvas roll and pulled out an old screwdriver, its wooden handle darkened by oil and time. He tapped the metal once, listening closely. The sound that followed wasn't random. It carried a frequency, a pulse that only he seemed to understand. "It's not the computer," Frank murmured, more to the aircraft than to anyone else. "It's the pressure valve on the accumulator, stuck from micro-vibration, 1/8 turn counterclockwise." He adjusted it gently, his wrist steady despite his trembling age. Beside him, Julia watched in awe. Her face was lit by a kind of reverence, her chest rising and falling as though she were witnessing a prayer rather than a repair. The silence was broken only by the faint scratch of metal against metal. Then Frank exhaled, stood, and nodded toward the cockpit. "Try her now." Julia climbed the ladder, her hands trembling. The moment she flipped the switch, a low rumble grew beneath them, deep and guttural. The F-15 came alive, the twin engines roaring, the hangar floor vibrating with power. The airmen erupted into cheers, disbelief giving way to elation. Monroe's stern expression softened into something rare, pride. Frank simply smiled, his eyes glistening as he whispered, "Welcome back, old girl." A week after the roar of the F-15 had shaken the hangar, Dry Creek returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The sun hung low over the desert, casting long golden shadows across the empty runway. In a small roadside cafe with faded blue curtains and the smell of roasted beans hanging in the air, Frank Mallory sat at the counter, his steel leg resting against the stool's base, tapping a slow rhythm that matched the ticking wall clock. He wore his usual flannel shirt and denim overalls, his gray hair combed neatly back, and in front of him sat a cup of black coffee, half empty, half warm. The door creaked open, and Blake Carter stepped inside. He was no longer in uniform. A simple brown jacket replaced his flight coveralls, his once sharp demeanor softened by humility. The arrogance that had once marked his every word was gone, replaced by the quiet gaze of a man who had learned the cost of pride. He hesitated before walking up to Frank. "Sir," he began softly, "I was wondering if you'd teach me from the beginning." Frank turned, his face unreadable for a moment. Then a slow smile spread across the weathered lines of his cheeks. "You know, son," he said, stirring his coffee with deliberate calm, "planes don't matter as much as the hands that keep them flying." Blake nodded, the words sinking deep. At a corner table, Julia Ross sat with a notebook open, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light. She was writing the story that would one day be passed down through generations of airmen. A story about the man who taught others that steel alone cannot make a machine live. Outside, General Monroe's car rolled by slowly. Inside, the old man and the younger one sat side by side, saying little but understanding everything. The cafe radio hummed a soft tune from the 70s, and Frank's steel leg tapped to the beat, not of war this time, but of peace. He lifted his cup slightly in a quiet toast. "To second chances," he said. Blake raised his own cup, eyes glistening. "And to the men who remind us what matters." The day faded into a warm desert twilight, leaving behind the soft clang of metal and memory, the sound of respect rediscovered. Sometimes the strongest engines are built not of steel, but of humility, patience, and respect. In life, just like in the hangar, listening with the heart can repair what pride once broke. Thank you for watching this story of courage and redemption. If it touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment below to tell us your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories from Hearts and Tales. May your days be steady, your skies clear, and your heart full of grace.